Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, Opioids and Fentanyl, Preventing Occupational Exposure to New Threats, sponsored by Ansel. This is Alan Ferguson, Associate Editor at Safety and Health Magazine, and I will moderate today's session. Thank you all for joining us. We'll start the presentation in a few minutes, but first I want to go over some preliminary items. The views of today's speaker and organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we will conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen and click the button for Submit Question. Feel free to ask your question anytime during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. And we'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we might not get to every question. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's speaker. For basic troubleshooting information, click the Help button located on your screen. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey. I will let you know more about that after the presentation. This webcast is archived so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Derek Warnecki, Vice President of Research and Development for Ansel's Healthcare Global Business Unit, whose responsibilities include quality assurance and regulatory affairs. Derek has nearly 20 years of experience in the personal protective equipment industry in both the medical and industrial sectors. Derek, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Hey, thank you, Alan. And first of all, thanks to all the attendees who dialed in today and are participating. We had a tremendous response with probably over 1,200 registered attendees, and we've really designed this so that the information will be both important and we think relevant to your daily lives and your safety. Also, really special thanks, Alan, to you, the National Safety Council, Safety and Health Magazine, really being instrumental in bringing meaningful educational content and information to the industry. So want to say thanks for that. And with that, let's get started. A quick overview on what we'll touch on today. First, I'll spend a decent chunk of time on the rise of fentanyl and what it is, why we're talking about this one specific drug or this specific opiate. Then we'll move in, we'll talk about exposure, what's going on with this kind of alarming trend, who should be concerned and why, how emergency responders and law enforcement professionals can stay protected. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the ancillary professions that are also being impacted by the widespread use of fentanyl. In Section 4, we'll touch on how Ansel is helping and what we're doing to provide information and protective solutions to the industry. And we'll end with a summary and Q&A. So that's our quick overview. But let's dive into to the rise of fentanyl and this increasing threat. So a few key stats to set the stage, and a huge rise. So what is it that it's alarming, or what is it that is so alarming here? Two things. One, it's a very large number of people being affected, and we're looking at deaths. The non-lethal overdose numbers are even more staggering. But if you look at a large number, and it's a rapidly increasing number, probably people are familiar with whether it's Prince or Carrie Fisher, who was Princess Leia, some of the more notable fentanyl overdose victims. But it's a large number within society today. And here's the impact it's having to the unintended or the inadvertent contacted people. Law enforcement reporting a double or double the number of encounters with fentanyl. So you can see immediately that it's broader use. It's nearly a perfect correlation. As the popularity grows, we expect the inadvertent or unintentional contact and exposures to continue to grow right alongside that number. And why is it? So here's kind of the answer to the why just fentanyl. The opioid category, right? We have some of our old favorites, whether it's heroin, morphine, codeine, oxycodone or OxyContin, and yet fentanyl in the category is greater than 50% of all the opioid deaths. So this one chemical is causing an inordinate number of deaths and or impact. And would say with most of the people I've talked with, many weren't even necessarily aware of fentanyl until just a few years ago. So part of our goal today is to really drive the awareness, see what's happening with fentanyl around, we're focusing on the U.S., but there are some global implications here. And what we can do to be better protected for this somewhat unknown but also uniquely dangerous threat. So let's talk briefly, what is fentanyl? Well, in a high level, it's a narcotic. It's a fantastic pain reliever. It's an anesthetic, so it can be used in surgical applications. It has a reasonable range of pain management applications in medical uses, all actually quite good. Some of the issues, and we're addressing this one specifically. This is an opioid, but we refer to it as a synthetic opioid, which simply means that it can be synthesized in labs. We don't have to wait for the flowers to grow or the poppies to be harvested. Some of the indicators we might use, this can be chemically synthesized and chemically modified. So what's the issue? Well, of course, it is very, very effective. It's also incredibly potent, at up to 100 times the strength of morphine and heroin. And in very small doses, it can have a tremendous effect. It as a drug, going back to how it works. So fentanyl easily passes or crosses what we call the blood-brain barrier. So it has ready access to the brain or to the opioid receptors in the brain. At that point, the brain will simply release a corollary amount, or we might even refer to a flood of dopamine. And this is where you get the pain management, you get the anesthetic, but you also get more of just a broad central nervous system depression. So quite strong, quite potent. It is and has been for the last few years a controlled substance, which simply means we call it prescription only, but how we enforce that is it's illegal to sell it or buy it without a prescription, is the key issue there. And if you look at in the illicit forms, the problem with a synthetic drug is the precursors are somewhat available. I wouldn't say readily available, but the precursors are somewhat available. They're not incredibly complex to make. They're not necessarily simple either. But if you go back to look at the potency, so at 100 times the potency of heroin, and I'll even talk about some versions of fentanyl that are even 100 times stronger than base fentanyl. So now you're talking up to 10,000 times stronger than heroin. Massive quantities don't have to be smuggled, right? This is no longer the days of people walking in with several kilos of hash or marijuana. This is very small amounts that can provide lethal doses. So, to come back, when used properly, very effective for severe trauma pain, for surgery, for cancer patients, has some wonderful benefits. The illicit uses, though, are quite dangerous. All right, how people become exposed. So the real simple answer here is any route to the bloodstream is an exposure route. Some are faster than others. You look at injecting or inhaling are the fastest, and I'm really focusing here on the unintentional exposure. Injecting is probably the most common from an illicit drug user perspective, but from an unintended exposure, you're most often going to deal with either inhaled or absorbed amounts. So these are quick ways into the bloodstream. They are somewhat controlled. These also include the body's natural filtration systems. So when we inhale, we have a natural sinus filtration system, and our dermal system is not bad either, but it's certainly not a protective layer. I would say ingesting is probably less common for EMS and for some of our law enforcement professionals. But as always, as a side note, is just to be cautious of needle sticks, and that's beyond fentanyl. Needle sticks are a problem throughout the industry in a variety of fronts. So let's look now at some of the medical forms and how it is commonly or intentionally used. You'll see the typical tablets, lozenges, patch, liquid. These are outside of the hospital care. So these are the forms that would be legal and available in the public domain. The patch is used oftentimes, and I'll get into how it's used in the illicit versions, but the patch can be a great chronic pain management system. So this might be common with someone going through a severe cancer treatment and needing that. The lozenges are probably somewhat less popular or less common, but these would typically be used alongside a patch or with a patch holder for what they would refer to as a breakthrough pain, or a pain that came on and that it usually rapid onset and exceeds what the patch or the controlled slow dose can provide. Of course, there are the liquid and tablet versions, and again, both beneficial and effective, with the core problem that they are highly addictive. So with that, let's look at the illicit forms and the uses and applications. So today, by far the most common applications are what might be referred to as some of the designer drugs. So these are mixtures in many cases, and this is where a lot of the problems are coming from. So it's not fentanyl in a straight form. It's not fentanyl in a controlled form or a pure form. It's fentanyl in a mixture. So picture heroin, caffeine, sometimes antihistamines are used. And so it's these cocktails or designer drugs that can give a blend of effects. Injecting, of course, is the most common. It's a direct route to the bloodstream. So injecting is what the drug users might refer to as the most impact per dollar or per amount. It bypasses the body's natural filtration systems. Ingesting, again, now it's got to be absorbed. It's slower. It's got to go through the large intestine, small intestine. Absorption rate still gets into the bloodstream, still effective. You can inhale, and in some cases, because the gel patches are not necessarily easily converted to other forms, but they can be burned and inhaled. And of course, there is absorption and mixtures. But what I want to do here is talk for a moment on why this particular version is so dangerous and why particularly the inadvertent or unintentional contact can be dangerous. But if you look at what I call the addiction process and talking with whether it's addicts in recovery or users, they'll use terms that are almost terms of endearment, that they immediately fell in love with the high from the first use, or comments like "nothing is going to stop me from using," or oddly, for the first time in my life, I felt right, or I felt okay. So what happens? They immediately fall in love with this high, with this feeling. It's an extremely strong addiction. Nothing's going to prevent them. So their body starts to respond as our body is designed to respond, which is it starts to build up a tolerance. And with that tolerance, that then requires stronger doses, higher levels, or stronger versions. So enter fentanyl. So let's say that an average heroin user is just needing a stronger or better high, so to speak. It could be cut with caffeine and with fentanyl to give it that strength. But it's a very small dose that you're talking about. So it's not. So if, for example, I compare it to alcohol, and let's just say that you're an average male and you go out and you go, hey, I can have 4 beers and I feel this way, and if I get up to 8, I'm going to start to get sick. It's much different if you're talking about extremely small quantities. It's hard to tell if a sip is just a taste or the touch of a tongue. So why is this important? It's important because with the users who have built up a fairly, in some cases, a very strong tolerance to the drug, and it's used in very small quantities, now enter the non-sensitized or intolerant person. So this is an emergency responder, a law enforcement officer, or just an unsuspecting janitor. for that person, a level where a user is, you could say, is still, fingers in quotes, functional, could be extremely toxic to the non-tolerant or intolerant system. So that's what we're seeing. There's a problem in stopping the tolerance or the body's natural defenses. If I go back to the alcohol analogy, what happens if your body's natural defenses to too much alcohol? Nausea and vomiting to expel, or two, you'll simply pass out and your body will process, but you'll typically pass out well ahead of a lethally toxic dose. Not the same with fentanyl. So very critical difference. It slowly depresses the normal responses, and it will start to shut down systems. So I spent a little time on this because, again, without a tolerance built up, it represents a broader danger, certainly for the users, but also for those of us, or particularly emergency responders and law enforcement personnel that could simply come in contact with the material. All right, so recognizing, and I'm actually going to touch on what the symptoms might be in terms of what to look for, because it's extremely small quantities that can be toxic. And I've kind of highlighted here, but we're talking about as little as a few grains of salt in the standard fentanyl version that could be toxic or even lethal, particularly to an intolerant system. And at those small levels, very high warning signs. So what to look for? And when I say severe sleepiness with inadvertent contact to the fentanyl, so you start thinking about your central nervous system really controlling all bodily functions, whether it's heart rate, respiratory rate, reaction times, but you will start to feel a heavy drowsiness. This might be that I just really need to lay down and take a nap right now. Everything will naturally slow down, might be less obvious. Breathing will become shallow. When I say difficulty breathing, I just mean that the breathing reflex, the normal breathing reflex, is being depressed. You could see cold, clammy skin, trouble walking or talking in people, and along with that drowsy effect. So when you look at the effects of the drug, can be fairly long-lasting. Now, there are some defenses. Once it's in, it is mostly driven, the effect is mostly driven by the concentration or how much has been absorbed into the bloodstream. The CDC still recommends, and I think most responders and healthcare providers are carrying Narcan, and it is so it's an opioid receptor antagonist is the simple answer. It's really, think of it as a disruptor. So the Narcan will both diminish and prevent the onset of further symptoms. So it's important. The struggle comes in that most of the responders today, or those who are carrying Narcan and prepared for this potential threat, are not necessarily carrying a sufficient dose. And so I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not here to dispense any kind of medical advice other than the new trend, and the CDC is recommending in many cases higher doses, double and triple the amounts of Narcan to counteract the effects of fentanyl. So what do you do? So these are the symptoms, some pretty clear steps, right? Just simply be aware of these early symptoms. Immediately think about preventing any further exposure. So if you're in a situation where there could be airborne fentanyl or powder, the powder version is going to be a common one that could be encountered. In a powder, move away to a well-ventilated area. Wash any potentially affected areas immediately. Use appropriate protective equipment in contact. And quick side note, so if you think something has become contaminated, wash it in its large doses of water. Don't use alcohol sanitizers. Interestingly, the alcohol sanitizers are actually decent carriers and can aid the process of a dermal exposure getting into the bloodstream. All right, so let's talk about exposure. who and where should be concerned. I'm not going to go through any of these news articles. There are plenty of them out in the public domain today, and many similar stories. What I really want to try to highlight is the breadth with which fentanyl is impacting the industry. So A, we have the core fentanyl drug. B, there are what are called the analogs of fentanyl. And these are chemically altered versions. They're altered to, in some cases, improve or increase potency, but not in all cases. For the most part, the fentanyl, the chemically modified versions of fentanyl or the analogs are really there to circumvent law enforcement. So fentanyl is a Schedule II drug. Well, how about we come up with a modified version of fentanyl that is not Schedule II listed? So it is an ongoing cat and mouse game, and there's no reason to believe that it's going to change anytime soon. But my point here is really being aware of the mild to very severe symptoms and the breadth with which, and we'll talk about some of the professions specifically, but the breadth with which exposure can happen. So who should be protected? Let's look at the list, and I'm going to pull up the first two, which is what we call the pre-hospital patient care. These are emergency responders, right? Whether it's ambulance, fire, and the law enforcement. Now, we look at these two groups because they encounter a variety of situations in their daily lives. And I look at these as kind of what I call the Boy Scouts of society. So these are the groups that have to be prepared for the most uncontrolled situations, unknown, uncertainty. So it is a little bit of that Boy Scout, always being prepared in these first responder situations. It could be the more obvious situation, like a drug bust, a search where it's already suspected. However, in many cases, it could be very unintentional. And again, being cautious that the user may have a tolerance that the EMS person or the law enforcement personnel won't have and could be more greatly impacted. So now let's get into the broader areas. Of course, there is some of the investigation evidence handling. Think about as simple as evidence storage. And this is both the tainted evidence and then contamination on the outside or external to evidence, in whether it's evidence or sample collection, or even performing medical procedures and fluid testing can all lead to an encounter with fentanyl. And again, not to reinforce enough, because of the small doses and because of the chemical variants or different versions of fentanyl out there, probably a higher level of caution required. Okay, so let's look quickly. So we look at what we call special operations. These are decontamination or hazardous material handling. These are clearly what I would call the most potentially dangerous situations, but they're also the most controlled, right? These teams know what they're in for. They're generally prepared. We do want to make sure that the preparation is complete. We'll touch on that as we get into the protection section. But these are, in some cases, controlled situations. Now let's look at just ancillary. And there are several ancillary professions that have been impacted. Maybe some of the more, you might not, or not top of mind, janitorial staff. Simply cleaning up and encountering, very small doses, but still leading to potentially severe problems. Healthcare professionals face kind of a unique situation, and when we get into the specific type of protection required, it will become more clear. But picture a healthcare professional is already wearing some protective equipment. So this can lead to that false sense of security for a healthcare professional. They're wearing gloves, but the gloves are a healthcare or an exam or patient exam style glove, probably not sufficient protection against fentanyl. You might even consider a mask, but a healthcare or even a surgical mask is not a filtration mask that a special operations or an emergency responder would use. So in some cases, I think that the threat with our healthcare teams can be even greater than with the other areas because of the unknown and the false sense of security. So now, given that and the breadth of where and how this drug can be contracted. Let's look at some of the specific worker protections that would be required. And I'm going to start with some of the work that our government agencies have done and are doing. There are efforts going on, across the board with the enforcement agencies to provide good information, to be able to use it to guide the decision-making process and answer that basic question. I'm in this situation. Am I protected? And I will tell you that, having read through a lot of the information, there's some fantastic information out there, but the on-site assessment and the judgment call is also incredibly important. So I won't spend a ton of time here, but consider there are minimal, moderate, and high-risk situations. And risk really is defined as how probable is exposure and how high or how great what could the level of exposure be. So clearly in a decontamination of a known area, the probability is certain and the exposure level is high. So it's very high risk. It's treated in a hazmat situation. If you also look at it, and it's fairly small and difficult to see here, but there are two grayed out sections in the pre-hospital care and in the law enforcement duties sections. That high risk is really saying not recommended. Now, this is a CDC statement that if your on-site assessment says that the risk is high and the potential exposure is there, not to take on the high-risk situation, right? Call in with the appropriately protected teams and with the right level of protection. Okay, so let's start with some of the simpler basics, and I will refer back to the CDC guidelines had really broken it up by area, whether it's respiratory, face and eye, hand and dermal protection, or body protection. So we'll look first at the glove side and how and what are the right things to look for. And if any of you are listening happen to be, auto mechanics or auto hobbyists and wear a standard glove when you're working on cars, you know the area of your body that's going to be the most contaminated when you're done, other than what was protected on the glove, and that's the wrist and lower forearm. So look for a glove with the right length, as we would say. Look for testing. And I have a separate slide, so I'll go a little detail that the gloves have actually been tested against the right challenge chemicals, in this case a fentanyl, and under the right conditions. Of course, always follow the guidelines for the glove, whether it is the timing for replacement or if you ever detect a breach, to certainly replace on time. And select the right glove or right size, of course. The CDC is recommending not latex, so look for synthetics like nitrile. But I want to focus for a moment also on this NFPA certification. So the National Fire Protection Association has come out with a fairly broad set of requirements. And it has what you would expect. Is the glove sufficiently strong? Can it resist punctures? Can it resist the right tears? Is it sufficiently thick? Does it have the right level of defects? But one of the things I really like in the NFPA certification is the dexterity test. So it's great if you're safe. It's great if you have the right level of protection. But if you can't simply perform the task, then the protective equipment can become somewhat useful. A couple of ancillary notes to include or think about. Double gloving is always an option. If you're worried, it really does reduce your risk in half or double your protection. Also looking for a lower, what we would call a lower AQL, or an acceptable quality level. And this is simply a statistical measure. I won't go into a ton of detail, but the lower the number, the lower the acceptable number of defects. So as a quick reference, for example, the FDA requires or mandates an AQL of 2.5 or lower for medical exam gloves. Industry-leading products are closer to an AQL or at an AQL of 0.65. So, roughly only allowing a quarter of the defects that the FDA system might allow. All right, choosing body protection. So when the situation warrants, and you've moved in. So we'll look at a few things. One, the body protection will provide or protect the user against both the particles, so the powder version, liquid version, also the potential for gas or vapors in burning versions. Of course, there are a variety of things, and I will talk a little bit on some of the Ancell body protection, where we'll look at how suits can be both tested, how we ensure that the product meets the needs or the broader needs of the user, and the design and the construction. So, for example, easy to look at, say, the material, but we look at considering the body protection as a complete system and how effective is that system in total. So again, guidance depending upon the area of operation, so for pre-hospital patient care or for law enforcement, investigations and evidence, particularly for special operations and decontamination. So as you move left to right, the use or need certainly starts to grow for body protection. And again, because of the multiple exposure modes, so I'll go back, right, it can easily be inhaled, dermal contact, vapor, whether that's a burning vapor or just small dust particles. All of these can be potentially toxic to lethal exposure methods. All right, so let's look at the actual testing procedure. So in this case, we're focusing on a liquid-borne test. And what we're doing within Ancell is we're using a test that's actually designed for chemotherapy drugs. I won't go into chemotherapy drugs. These are, of course, cancer treatment drugs. They're also extremely strong, and they're considered cytotoxic drugs, which means that they're designed to kill cells. So these chemotherapy drugs, thankfully they don't have, in fact, they have quite the opposite effect. They not only don't have an addictive feel, you'll see very negative side effects for people on chemotherapy drugs. But they're an extremely dangerous drug, and this is one where the need for protection against unintended or inadvertent contact is equally important. So anyhow, the chemotherapy drug standard is probably the most applicable. It is about 10 times, or it's exactly 10 times more rigorous than a standard chemical protection test or the standard ASTM test. So how does this process work? So if you look at the droplets on the top, if you think of the green layer as a film of either the glove or the protective suit, the droplets above are trying to get through. The gray disc underneath is the detector. There are a variety of detection techniques, but you can think of it as a sniffer or an extremely sensitive detector. So you can have a full challenge chemical on one side, but we're able to detect just molecules of the chemical coming out the other side. And that's that 10x sensitivity, or the 10x more strict or rigorous. So a fairly straightforward test. The quick side note, and we'll touch on it in body protection, of course, is that testing the material itself is not necessarily sufficient. Testing the entire construction is really more the requirement. All right, as we head into the final section, we'll look at a few of the Ancell solutions. So first one I want to touch on is a simple but elegant hand protection solution. So this is a product, LifeStar. It is specifically designed for emergency responder situations. It is longer, or what we would call an extended cuff. So now you're going to get the hand and wrist protection, lower forearm. It is a two-layer technology, so you can see by the two colors. In essence, it is a bit of that, what we might call the double gloving effect, but built into one. It's the industry-leading, very low AQL. So again, lowest level of breaches or pinhole defects in the industry, and a very high fentanyl resistance. So tested in the most rigorous testing methods, still exceeding the 4-hour benchmark. So providing that level of protection. It's also extremely durable. So that goes back to the NFPA type certification, puncture resistant, tear resistant, high level of durability and strength. And then I'll finish with, it has for its thickness and level of protection, a fairly soft and comfortable feel. So again, if you think about going back to being safe is wonderful, but being safe could also be avoiding the situation. So being safe and comfortable is also wonderful, but it's important that you're safe, comfortable, and able to perform the tasks at hand or perform the job. So specifically designed in that approach, and a part of the line. Certainly, I don't mean to propose this as the entire, but we don't want to go through a product demo as much as an introduction to some of the key points to look for. Let's look at body protection. And within the Ancell line, what you'll find, and we looked at how this might marry up with the CDC requirements earlier in terms of everything from fairly lightweight, breathable, and comfortable to the very heavy duty, both chemically resistant, particle resistant products. And again, what we will do is we'll take the view, what I would call a total system view. So for example, if you're looking at a body protection solution, a total system view might be a total inward leakage. So what could expect to breach the system, not necessarily just the materials. That is, of course, the material it's made of. It's the construction, how the product is put together. It is how the seams are made and formed, and it is the testing and certifications or the information that supports those requirements. And again, this is a snapshot of the line, and our high-level goal, of course, is going back to having the appropriate protection in the right situation, supporting the NIOSH and CDC guidelines, and providing that breadth. So I'll also say that, of course, we are here to help answer any specific questions. And with that, quick summary on the fentanyl. Just to recap some of the high points. What is it that's alarming? It's the number of incidents and the rapid growth of those incidents. It is becoming more common in our society, and therefore the chance of inadvertent contact is certainly growing. If we look at the right solutions, and I'll talk a little bit, I think most people or many are familiar with the incidents in Hamilton County or Cincinnati reported. And going back, it was nearly 2 years ago that Hamilton County reported 176 overdose-related or fentanyl-related deaths. And the sense there was that afterwards that there would be a reprieve, that both the dealers and the users were now more aware of the risks and the extreme risks related to fentanyl, and so that there would be a reprieve or a downtrend. And I'm sad to say that while I think that was a good and reasonable prediction, that it turned out to be optimistic. If you look at Hamilton County, which tracks quite closely, by the way, they're probably one of the lead research counties in supporting working with both the DEA and with NIOSH. But 2017 was another record number of deaths for Hamilton County over 2016. And that includes a very high level of focus. So we know what's happening. We know that growth is going to continue. I'd love to take an optimistic view. I don't think it makes sense. What makes sense is to look at the facts and be prepared. So training, be ready for what you go into. Know the potential issues. Have the right protective equipment to be safe, but to still be functional. And lastly, use the resources that are out there. Again, NIOSH, CDC have published an extensive amount of training specific to opioids and to fentanyl. OSHA also has some outstanding hazmat training materials, somewhat broader. But this is the simple, just be informed. and be prepared. The risk is real, it's growing, and it is having more of what we call the unintended consequences on society. And with that, Alan, I'm going to turn it over to you. I will reach out to everyone listening that we are certainly here. At Ansel, our goal, I think, is very much aligned with our National Safety Council friends and the Safety and Health magazine, but it is to provide information, to provide educational training, and to provide the right solutions to the users out there, and to keep people safe and productive.
All right. Thank you very much, Derek. Great job. Thank you as well for your excellent insights and expertise. Before we start the Q&A, I want to remind everyone of the evaluation survey we're asking to complete. The survey should be appearing on your screen. Your input is important because it will help us improve future webcasts. If you do not see the evaluation survey on your screen, please turn off your pop-up blocker. You may also access the survey by clicking the survey button near the lower right part of your screen. With that, let's get to some questions. The first one, I understand the risk for first responders and police officers, but why the major concern for other industries like hospitality?
Oh, great question. So I'll start with this rapid spread and a little bit of this cat and mouse game. So again, we're looking at a material that only needs to be produced in very small quantities. Think about 50 grams being a sufficient quantity. It's a very small amount, but a sufficient quantity to cause multiple overdose and deaths. So what happens is you end up, whether it's with smaller labs or with what the DEA might refer to as these milling operations, and these are simpler versions where they're actually just transforming the raw drugs into one of the consumable forms. So this could be making the designer form. So again, you don't need a ton of space. You don't need highly sophisticated equipment. So what happens? This could be in hospitality, thinking hotel type situations. Probably more commonly could even be landlords who have had rentals or portions of rentals. So it is this prevalence in society, this high demand, and of course you can always follow the money, right? Where there's money to be had, the people or the activities will follow. So that's why we're really emphasizing that this has become somewhat of a broader issue.
Do you have a comment that another group of potentially affected people are landlords, to kind of piggyback off your question, off your response? And this person says, I just had to deal with cleaning out personal belongings in a house where I knew fentanyl was being used, and it was pretty scary.
Yeah, that would be scary.
So our next question is, what PPE precautions should responders use in dealing with unknown fentanyl versus known fentanyl exposures?
Yeah, great question. My initial reaction would be to consider them all as somewhat unknown until tested and confirmed. So a couple of interesting facts. One, the CDC has come out and stopped or asked that on-site testing of the drugs be stopped. And that's because these have been some of the more dangerous situations. So what has happened is, again, it goes back to that situational assessment. Is there reason to believe that fentanyl could be present? And again, you're looking for some of the telltale signs, whether it's the powder, heroin, or the use of more commonly heroin, other ancillary additives that could be present. But the CDC or the DEA has also said, don't test on site. Treat it as an unknown. Even the testing labs can take some time to really confirm that it's fentanyl and the version. So if you're looking at a very strong, like carfentanil, an offshoot being much stronger than fentanyl, it would be an unknown. So the top of my immediate reaction would be treat them all as uncertain, and treat them all as the potentially the most highly toxic or strongest versions.
Our next question, is fentanyl cheaper to buy than other drugs?
Oh, that's a great question. Here's the unfortunate answer: yes. And yes, because on a pound for pound basis, probably not. But if you only need 1/100th, 1/500th, 1/1000th the amount, then a very small quantity becomes more easily produced. And so here's a sample situation, and a lot of these drugs are being produced. I'm not going to make this a China problem. I want to be clear right now that the biggest issue in the world is in the U.S. The most number of overdose deaths are by far in the U.S., but there are a lot of the labs, whether they're making the precursors or the drugs, the fentanyl labs out of China. And now picture a small quantity. Think about it. A common approach might be to order online and maybe spend, a few $100. By few, I mean, less than $500. It would be labeled as an inkjet chemical or an inkjet material, or a powdered ink. Comes in a very small receptacle. So unfortunately, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you can, for under $1,000, you can produce, hundreds of lethal doses of fentanyl.
Our next question, our company services portable restrooms. Would this add a higher exposure threat than they already have?
I'm sorry, Alan, I just missed the first part of the question. Can you repeat that?
I'm sorry, the first part is our company services portable restrooms, and would this add a higher exposure threat than they already have?
Yeah, I would, particularly in some of the portable restrooms, they probably are already receiving training on things like watching for sharps. So you're starting to see sharp containers appear in more restrooms, acknowledging that sometimes this could happen. But some awareness training would probably be a good idea. And again, I would go back to the person that is just servicing has an intolerant system, and they could come in contact with the same level that a more tolerant person who still seems very functional encountered. So, my advice in these situations would be, and it would be more broad. I still think in those situations probably the biggest problem is needle sticks.
Our next question, is there any data on exposure to utility workers who enter homes?
Wow. This is probably even harder. I think with law enforcement and emergency responders, there's a lot of training and a very, very intentional training around situational assessment and risk assessment. You talk to an experienced first responder. Not only are they good at it, it's second nature. They know they immediately can come, whether it's a triage situation, an assessment situation. Risk assessment is simply part of the daily task. If you look at more of the home, I think the problem is still training and awareness, and I certainly would not advocate that we start putting everyone in the world in protective equipment. It would be an undue or an excess. So is the risk higher? I don't know, and here's part of here's part of the complexity of the question. We know that it's becoming more prevalent in society. We know that it's more dangerous than drugs that we've encountered in the past. We know that because of the way it interacts with our natural system, that rapid and onset, kind of a depressed functionality. And almost a euphoric feeling along with that depressed state. So we know that all these risks are higher. The thing is, if you look at the number of facilities where it would be required, where there might actually be production going on or dangerous quantities going on, it doesn't take many to supply, even though, the broad number is probably big. As a percentage, it's still quite small. But I would probably say, somewhat similar to the previous, is that folks going into unknown situations should just be trained in situational assessment and always be prepared to have a back out plan, whether it's as simple as great, Mr. Jones, yes, I just need to check in with my supervisor to let him know that I have arrived at your household. Walk out, call someone, say, this place looks suspicious. I'm not comfortable heading in. Can you get me out of here? But I call that more situational assessment training than necessarily specifically fentanyl training. I think that it's some of the ancillary professions that I'm more concerned about, and these are good examples. They're probably more remote, but it still speaks to the need for broader training.
Our next question, do you think CDC or NIOSH will start mandating fentanyl-tested products? They are just recommended now.
Very speculative. I believe it would be a great idea to start having some classification testing. But I also think that where they would stand if they were on the call with us would be that they have made some good recommendations. They typically will avoid mandates when it comes to the broader public. They will use more mandated requirements in specialized areas. That could be in the special operations or hazmat protection. So no, I think if we waited or relied upon them to provide a mandate, that could be a miss on our part. The recommendations are quite sound. They're quite sensible. I would also just say a little bit off the question topic, but there really is a tremendous amount of work going on both with the DEA labs and CDC or NIOSH laboratories. They're working collaboratively with local authorities. They're working on better testing systems across the country. They're working on both prevention and enforcement activities. And I'm relatively impressed with the body of knowledge that they have amassed. So I do think their recommendations are sound, and I'm skeptical that we'll see any mandated requirements or certainly any broad-based mandatory requirements.
Our next question, does fentanyl have any odors?
That's a good question, and I'm going to have to say you stumped me. I don't know. Now I'm going to have to look it up, and we'll publish the answer. Because of the different forms that we would want to look at how the different forms might have different odors. There are also, when I talked about the chemically altered, so think about adding a methyl group, for example, that could add an odor or an acetyl group. Some of these chemical modifications could change the odor, but I'll just compliment whoever came up. Great question, and I don't have a great answer for you.
Our next question, what about logistics companies that are unsure if fentanyl may be in a package that can be damaged? Would carrying Narcan be recommended?
That's a tough one. There are actual incidents and documented incidents of postal workers and package handlers being impacted, both from the leakage of contents, but more commonly from intentionally contaminated items. This is very much an opinion, but if I compared fentanyl, if I wanted to use fentanyl as an insidious way to get someone sick, so I'll use the anthrax example. Where anthrax was sent through the mail system, it was intended to contaminate. The problem was the anthrax didn't have tremendous value outside of some malicious use. The fentanyl is quite protected and highly valued by its owner. So I don't think so the cases where you have intentional contact, I think are less probable. Right, so a truly malicious person, I would probably go with something like an anthrax. Two, the contents generally sent in a powder form, in a small quantity, and in a plastic vial. So the odds of damaging. So compare a tub or a 5-gallon drum or a 10-kilo package wrapped in foil and plastic. The damage is easier. the spread more readily probable. With small quantities and relatively stout packaging, I wouldn't classify it as a high risk, but I would go back to the same precautions. One thing that's probably, there are no certainties, but what you're probably not going to find is, for example, a Tide box full of fentanyl powder. That would be, for fentanyl, an absolutely massive quantity being moved around, and that probably wouldn't be shipped. The ones that we know of and read about are generally very small quantities. By small quantities, I'm talking 50 grams or less, which is less than 2 ounces of material being shipped around. So, again, the training awareness is always recommended.
Our next question, if we report an incident to the authorities, will we immediately know what the substance was that we found?
Yeah, this is when I love this question. It seems like we should, and it's one of the struggles that the authorities are having right now. So if you look at what the DEA is doing, where they come into, they're constantly hunting down and encountering. Here's the problem. Right now, the rule of thumb, so to speak, is 2 weeks to accurately identify a substance. Having on-site testing or some of the kind of previous test kits, these are typically, when you're looking at on-site drug testing, these are indicator kits. They're not designed to be specific. They're not designed to be highly accurate. They're more of what we call litmus tests, a yes, no, we believe it's present. And here again, the DEA is asking law enforcement professionals not to do on-site testing. So here's the scary answer to the question is no. It's very unlikely that you would know quickly, and that's one of the reasons. So I want to touch on this quickly because it's a great point. Symptoms are going to be your fastest indicator. So go back, review, look at what the contact symptoms could be. Be aware of those. The test results would, in most cases, the damage has long been done before the test results come in and are confirmed.
How does the level of risk compare between inhalation and dermal exposure?
I don't know that I can give a good comparison. Those are my number one and number two concerns. And I'll give you an example. Inhalation, of course, because the particles can be quite small and you need very little to become quickly intoxicated or to even have extreme or severe symptoms. The problem is in poorly lit areas, a fine dust, even a somewhat invisible dust, is always a concern. So in a situation where the situational assessment would say, looks like potential drug production, inhalation is one of my first, because we tend to be a little more conscious of the things that we touch. Rather than breathing. So if you're in those types of situations, respiratory rates can go up, so you can start breathing more quickly. Adrenaline will start to flow depending on the situation. Both are important. The dermal can be a slower. That's why the dermal patches are so good for the longer term. Inhalation is a much faster method of getting the symptoms. So certainly be careful of both. Basic gloves can be a wonderful first preventive action, along with a simple, so I'll back up, with fentanyl, because it's not an oil base or it's not an oil containing. If you look at the NIOSH ratings for even masks, a simple N100 mask or particle filtration mask can be reasonably effective. Now, this is not a hazmat mask. This is a simple protection. But in those two, got to be very sensitive or very cautious about inhalation. And alongside particle, if there's any burning, or smell of burning, then the vapors can be equally toxic, and they're also very fast. The vapors can even more easily defeat our sinus and our natural filtration system.
All right, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but all of today's unanswered questions will be forwarded to our speaker. Once again, I hope you take the time to fill out the evaluation survey on your screen to give us your feedback. That ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank Derek Warnacki, everyone at Ansel, and, of course, all of our listeners. Have a safe day.